You might know this through history, but in 1988, when the Iran and Iraq war finally ended, Saddam Hussein tried to become friends with Iran once again. They returned a lot of the lands that they had taken and removed their troops from there. But this wasn't like a nice thing he was doing. He was getting ready for another attack because he wanted to make Kuwait a part of Iraq. On the 2nd of August 1990, with an insane force, Saddam's army entered Kuwait, and in only 2 days, they took over the entire country. What Saddam did, of course, enraged a lot of world governments, especially powerful ones like the US. And that's why Western countries, especially the US, entered the Persian Gulf to take Kuwait back from Saddam. This is when the First Persian Gulf War begins, a war that lasts about 6 months. After 6 months of hard battle, Saddam is pretty much forced to make its way out of the country. You have to know that between the city of Basra in Iraq and Kuwait, there is a highway called Highway 80, a pretty wide highway that was fairly straight. So the Iraqi army starts heading that way with their tanks and military vehicles. And of course, a lot of stolen goods from the Kuwaiti people. On the 25th of February 1991, the Iraqi military started heading towards Basra. The Western countries that were not a fan of Saddam Hussein wanted to hurt this military very badly, and this was their opportunity. So the militaries of the US, Canada, Britain, and France coordinated with one another to wait for the Iraqi army to be completely on Highway 80 and then surprise attack them. About 24 hours they started heading back. It's 26th of February 1991, and pretty much the entirety of this highway is filled with tanks and military vehicles. Very early in the morning, around 6, this is when the Americans lifted off their Grumman A6 intruders and they started dropping anti-tank bombs. Saddam Hussein himself, including his army, did not guess that they were going to be attacked on this highway. And the thing is, they had no plans of defending themselves. And this was a wide open desert area, so there was nowhere to go. Some military vehicles went straight into the desert, so maybe they can get away from the hellfire. And some started to speed up to outrun it. But unfortunately, there was nowhere to go, because after the A6 intruders, a lot of the military aircrafts, which was mostly US aircrafts, started dropping Mk-20 anti-tank bombs that destroys anything it's confronted with. One of the first things the US military did is basically destroy both ends of the highway, so there's nowhere to go. It is basically a cluster of Iraqi military vehicles waiting to get destroyed. So basically, you're in the middle of a crap show and you can't go anywhere. When you're trapped like this, you basically cannot do anything. There's nothing you can protect yourself from. There's not even a bush where you can go inside and hide in it. This highway was about 100 kilometers long, and 80 kilometers of it was filled with Iraqi military vehicles that were stopped end to end. And the hellfire continued for 10 hours long. Most of the attacks were done by the US Air Force, but with the help of the other 3 countries. This highway passes an area called the Motla Ridge, and this section is about a mile long. This area was the deadliest place of this entire highway because there was a cluster of military vehicles that took the most amount of damage. In this tiny area, there was over 300 vehicles trapped, and since this was only a mile long, it got the name Mile of Death. This highway was over 60 miles long, but this 1 mile in particular took the most amount of damage. After 10 hours of bombs, rockets, and all types of hellfire, this is when the US military entered from the both sides on foot and started inspecting it. There was still a lot of burning things going on, there was a lot of smoke, and there was still people alive. A lot of the soldiers were killed, a lot of them started to surrender and get arrested, and of course there was a few soldiers in between the cars shooting back at the American soldiers, and all of those soldiers were killed. The soldiers that entered this battlefield have explained that this was one of the worst experiences they had, because you would still see bodies alive, bodies that were half decapitated but they were screaming for help. and we could do nothing but put them out of their misery and kill them. After pretty much clearing the entire highway, this is when the reporters finally show up. And all these videos you're watching is taken by these reporters. So we really don't have footage of the actual attack and the bombs dropping, but we do have a lot of aftermath footage. In these videos we can't really show the dead bodies, but most of the reporters said most of the bodies you see on the ground are not complete. And this is the reason they couldn't really get a number on how many people were killed in this attack. The first day, these reporters said that around 300 Iraqi soldiers were killed. But this was far from the truth, because as the days went on, the number went higher and higher. And it got to a point where you really couldn't come up with a number on how many soldiers were killed. So that's why they just said over 1,000 soldiers were killed on this attack. And they say this number to this day because there is really no official number they can say. The American general that was in charge of this operation was Norman Schwarzkopf. 4 years after this attack, meaning in the year 1995, during an interview, he explained the reason we attacked the highway is because we brought so much weapon to the Persian Gulf and we couldn't take it back. So we decided to dump all of it on the Iraqi forces and kind of pay them back for what they did in Kuwait. And as you know, more than 90% of the attack was done by the US Air Force. What General Schwarzkopf said was kind of controversial, and it made a lot of people angry. They basically were saying that the US military gets bored and wants to test its military weapons on these guys. But other experts believe that they had to do this to tell Saddam Hussein that you can't just invade other countries and get away with it. The numbers of the highway of death look like this. More than 1,000 dead, more than 2,000 were arrested, and 2,700 military vehicles destroyed. Either way, Iraq suffered a heavy defeat, and since they went back to their country, this is when the American troops decided to leave. But after a few years, when you get to the year 2003, this is when the Iraq War begins. And this time, the US military actually enters Iraqi soil and takes over the country. This is Saddam Hussein, and I'm pretty sure everybody knows who that is. Whenever you talk about Saddam Hussein, there's always something to do with the Iran-Iraq War, the Iraq War, or the Persian Gulf War. But this video is not about that. We want to talk about a deal that went down in Saddam's regime that seemed like it was a great deal for the country. In the year 1980, a revolution has happened in Iran, and Saddam is trying to figure out on how to take advantage of this situation and attack Iran while they're not organized. At this time, Iraq has another problem as well, a shortage of vehicles, especially government vehicles and taxis. Even though Saddam didn't really have a good relationship with the United States, he loved American cars. And that's why he exclusively wanted to import American cars. He didn't want to deal with the Europeans or the Japanese or the other Asian countries. But there was a problem here as well, because after Saddam Hussein executed all his rivals in the government, they put a sanction on him. And in a way, Iraq and the United States did not have a relationship, so there was a sanction on purchasing goods from the US. So technically, Saddam could not make a deal with an American company, but it seems like Saddam didn't care about these sanctions. He calls up the General Motors CEO to directly talk to him. At this time, GM is the biggest motor vehicle manufacturer in the world, not just the United States. So in a way, GM had power to bypass these types of sanctions and get these vehicles sold to the government of Iraq. So the deal went down like this. 25,000 1981 Chevy Malibus at a price of $4,000 each. And that comes out to about $100 million. And since Saddam likes the price and he loves American cars, he thinks it's a great deal, so he agrees. So General Motors had a big problem on their hand. How are they gonna take the car to Iraq even though it's sanctioned? They very easily went around this sanction, and all they had to do is take the cars to Canada and ship them through Canadian ports to Iraq instead of the US. But let's look at the vehicle that Saddam has just ordered. 1981 Chevy Malibu. The Malibu that is sold to Iraq is not the same as the Malibu that's sold in the US or any other place. It was specially made for the Iraqi market. First of all, it was only offered in 3-speed manual, no automatics. The Iraqi one had bigger radiators because it was going to a desert and it's much hotter, and the interior was very much simplified. It didn't even have a modern radio at that time. They just used old stock to fulfill the orders. If you're any familiar with American cars, you know that the 1980s was the worst era for American cars. And the main reason was that gas was extremely expensive in the US in this time. So the American car companies had to completely change their designs. They had to ditch the V8s and create V6s and 4-cylinders that they were not very much familiar with. And when you don't have experience and you have to get something done in a short period of time, you usually mess it up. The engine that was put on the 1981 Chevy Malibu was a 3.8-liter V6. And obviously, this engine was garbage. But Saddam was expecting those good old American V8s that don't die. V8s from the 1970s and the 1960s were so durable that you could literally overheat them, drive them in traffic, and then nothing would happen to it. It was truly that reliable. Saddam was expecting an engine like that, but he got arguably one of the worst engines of all time in American history. Another problem was that General Motors wasn't making a whole lot of money because they were spending a whole lot of it on R&D. So everything was cheaper. The suspension. Either way, they produced these cars and send them to Iraq through Canada. And on the first shipment, 13,000 of these cars get to Iraq. It didn't even take 1 month for these cars to start having problems. At first, there was a clutch problem. The big problem was that in Iraq, there was no General Motors dealership where you can just take your car to get it fixed. So they were forced to send 100 technicians over to Iraq to figure out what's wrong with these cars and fix them. The technicians quickly realized that it's the throwout bearing for the clutch that is not allowing it to be put in gear. So they had to order new throwout bearings for every single Malibu and swap it out as a recall. But these problems were just the beginning. Even though the Malibu that was made for Iraq had much bigger radiators, but still in the Iraqi heat, it would not last. And the cars, even though they had a few thousand kilometers on them, they would very quickly overheat. Another problem is that it did not have a temperature gauge, so you couldn't even tell that it's overheating. After the car has been overheated, a red light would turn on, which is pretty much too late. You know the engine is toast. Of course, Saddam Hussein was not happy about the cars because he was expecting the tanks he was used to from the 70s. So they were not very happy with their purchase. And General Motors has said, we fit bigger radiators and we fixed the clutch problem. It might be a you problem that you're having a whole lot of problems. And that made Saddam Hussein to decide to tell General Motors to go F themselves and not send the other 12,000 Malibus. So GM was faced with another problem. They had 12,000 brand new Chevy Malibus just sitting in a Canadian parking lot waiting to be shipped to Iraq. But Iraq is not going to pay for them. Saddam didn't even have the money because during this time he had begun the war with Iran and all the funds was going towards the war. This is when General Motors tells all the Chevrolet dealers in Canada that you should sell these Chevy Malibus for only $6,500, which is much cheaper than the North American version of this car. To their surprise, these cars sold like hotcakes because they were much cheaper and they were simple, so they didn't last very long. And they sold it for $2,500 more than what they were going to sell it to Saddam. In Canada, people had it much easier. First of all, it was much colder, so the overheating problem was not a thing. And second of all, they had access to the Chevrolet dealer. If it broke down, they would just take it to the dealer and they were forced to fix it because it was still under warranty. You might be familiar with the lemon law buyback. In North America, there is a rule: if there is a car that you buy brand new under warranty and it keeps on breaking down, If the dealer is not able to fix that problem about 3 times and they're unsuccessful, that car is gonna turn into a lemon. It means that the car is so garbage that even the manufacturer can't fix it. So when a lemon law happens, the dealer is forced to buy the car back, sell him another one, or give their money back. A lot of these Malibus actually turned into lemon in Canada. Another interesting fact is that this car was very famous in Canada by the name of Iraqaboo, which is like Iraq added to the name Malibu. The Malibus that turned into lemon pretty much died, and soon after, a lot of them actually started to rust out. Most of the cars were in the northeast of North America, so of course they're gonna rust out very easily with how salty the roads are. And being that the build quality of this vehicle was garbage, it was no surprise that these things started to fall apart. But another interesting thing is that some of these Iraqaboos survived. It was most likely the very low mileage ones that stayed in the garage and they weren't driven in the winter. Those aren't that valuable or collectible, but they bring good money, like $5,000 to $10,000 depending on the condition of the vehicle. It's not like a 57 Chevy where they bring $100,000, but it brings something noticeable. If you're familiar with Iraq's history, you'll know that on the 16th of July 1979, Saddam Hussein performs a coup d'etat and removes Hassan al-Banna from power, and he becomes the president of Iraq. But you have to know, before Hassan al-Banna was removed from office, Saddam Hussein was pretty much the most powerful man in Iraq already, and he was the one calling the shots everywhere, so it wasn't like it was gonna be any different. Anyways, Saddam becomes the president of Iraq, and one of his first missions was to eliminate all the traitors in the Ba'ath Party. And by traitors, we mean the people that didn't want Saddam to be president. On the 22nd of July, meaning 6 days after Saddam is officially sworn in as the president, he tells all the party members, for an important meeting, let's meet on this day in the Al-Hult Hall in Baghdad. Of course, as you know, when Saddam was trying to take power, there were a lot of party members that were against it. Some of them were straightforward with Saddam and didn't want him in office, and some others were secretive, and they were trying to overthrow him before he could gain power. And that's why it was important for Saddam to have every party member, good and bad, in that hall where he was gonna speak. So everybody's gathered in the hall and Saddam comes moving in. Even though he has only been a president for less than a week, but the entire country is in his hands. And everybody knows that, especially the people in the room. When Saddam goes to the podium, he doesn't speak right away, and people are getting nervous and sweating heavily. And it doesn't help that it's 40 degrees outside, and the air conditioning does not work in the hall. We're not actually sure if it didn't work or it was purposefully kept off to make the people more tense and nervous. And it makes sense that Saddam ordered the AC to be off because he's the president and they're not gonna bring him in a hall where the AC doesn't work in the middle of the summer. So this was another method to make all his opponents more nervous. But anyways, while these guys are sweating, Saddam is not speaking. He's just moving his papers around and causing the situation to get even more tense. And when he acts like he's about to speak into the microphone, he goes back to playing with his papers. The entire hall, where there are hundreds of people sitting, is super quiet, and the only thing you're hearing is Saddam's papers being moved around. An important fact that you should know is that before Saddam came to this hall, he had one of his guys, or should I say one of his right-hand mans, to speak with this hall. But this speech was never recorded, so we're not sure exactly what was said. But basically what was said is this. There has been a conspiracy found against the country of Iraq and our president Saddam Hussein. Some higher-ups in the Ba'ath Party are conspiring against our country and our president, and their goal is to overthrow him. After saying this, the man speaking takes a few second pause and says, the conspirators are in the hall right now, and he leaves the podium. A few minutes of complete silence continues, where Saddam starts to walk into the hall. And this was one of the main reasons why the people were already super nervous. Eventually, after Saddam plays with his papers, he starts to speak. The first thing he says, he calls Mohi Abdul Hossein Mashhadi to the mic. Mashhadi was a powerful man in the Ba'ath Party, and he knows only a few days ago, he has publicly announced that we should not allow Saddam Hussein to be the president of Iraq. After Saddam calls Mashhadi to the mic, he goes sits to the table next to him where there's different microphones as well. And Mashhadi goes behind the podium and starts to speak. Mashhadi goes straight into confessing. He said me and other party members were trying to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And while he's confessing to the entire room, Saddam is sitting down and he starts to light a Cuban cigar. While all this is happening, Mashhadi is going on about the confession. He says, I was the one behind the conspiracies. I was the one to get other party members to go against the president. I was the one that worked against our beautiful country. And we have to say that all these were a lie, because before he came up to the stand to speak, he was brutally tortured. And they basically told him what to do, what to say when he goes up on the stand, or we will do the same things to your wife and kids. And this is why Mashhadi is pretty much forced into saying all this, even though it was all not true. He was one of the party members that publicly went against Saddam, but he was making it look like he was a conspirator. So he knew if he doesn't do this, his family would be killed. That's why he said exactly what he was told. Anyways, he continues his few-minute speech and he goes back to his chair and sits down. After Mashhadi leaves, Saddam slowly gets up from his chair, walks slowly to the podium, and once he's behind the microphone, he doesn't start speaking right away again. He starts to light his cigar. Saddam wanted to show his opponents that he's not in a hurry, because he has all the people that went against him inside the room, and there's no way for them to run. After taking a hit from his cigar, he finally begins to speak and says, what should we do to these traitors? Everybody knows the answer. There is no other answer than the sword. If you could check the chairs in this hall, it would be all wet. Some because of sweat, and some because of other substances. After Saddam says there's no other way than the sword, everybody started clapping. After the applause stops, Saddam says, if I call your name, get up, say the party slogan, and walk out. One by one, he calls different names. They get up, say the party slogan, and walk out the hall. Nobody told these guys what was waiting for them on the other side of the door, but they had an idea. Everybody followed Saddam's orders and said the thing and went out. But one guy would not say the slogan. He complained and said, me? What did I do? And Saddam didn't even care. He angrily repeated and said, if I call your name, say the party slogan and walk out. And this man didn't say anything and walked out. One by one, 68 names were called, and everybody left after saying the slogan. And after calling all these, Saddam turns to the people and says, thank you for your loyalty. And everybody begins crying tears of joy and clapping. Some were clapping so hard like their country won the World Cup. Even Saddam shed a tear. We're not sure if this was tears of joy, or tears of sadness, or tears of he won finally. We're not truly sure. What do you guys think? But let's see what happened to the 68 men that were walked out of the hall. Anybody that was taken out of the hall was arrested and put into a military vehicle, and they were taken straight to jail. The day after the arrests happened, it was their court date. After a few hours, 22 of the 68 men were sentenced to death. But Saddam said to kill these 22 men, we're not gonna need an executioner. the executioners were going to be chosen by Saddam himself, and it was the men that didn't get this death sentence. So basically they were told to kill the traitor that was sentenced to death if you want to live. The 22 men that were sentenced went into the yard behind the courtroom, and 22 other men was chosen as the executioner for these men. And one by one they were handed a handgun and told to shoot the guy on the other side. The people that were told to execute their party members never killed anybody. That's why they couldn't do it. Their hands would shake so bad that they would miss few shots until they would finally hit the target. Saddam also told the regular people of Baghdad that there are traitors being executed in this yard behind this wall. And while all these executions are happening, there are Iraqi people cheering for their new president on how he's killing the traitors and the people that are anti-Iraq. The purge that Saddam performed in front of all his party members had a few goals. He wanted to tell everybody in politics who's boss, and if you're disloyal, what would happen. And another thing, he pretty much showed the people, if you go against the government, this could happen to you as well. After this purge was performed, Iraq entered a silent era. Nobody dared to go against Saddam's word,